For today, we're going to go through how to return data from backend workflows. There are two ways that we're going to go about it. One of which is using the API connector, where you turn a backend workflow into an API that you call within itself through the API connector. The second is using something called the app connector, which is normally used to connect multiple different apps together, but you can connect your own app to itself and then use that to call backend workflows and get data back. So we'll go through those examples really quickly and help you be able to return data back from your backend workflows. All right, so this app is what I have set up. It's pretty standard, pretty basic. Just you're going to put in some text and some numbers in. We're going to run a backend workflow, and it's going to return that back. It's not going to do anything complex. Obviously, you can do a lot more complex things with calling other APIs and getting data back and then structuring that into a return from your backend workflow. So step one, we're going to create a backend workflow. All right, so if you haven't already set up the backend workflow, you would go to your settings and API, and you want to make sure that this is checked here to enable workflow API and backend workflows. Once it is done, you can then go up here to backend workflows here. And then I believe in the very near future, there's going to be a little icon here that enables you to go to backend workflows directly in this bar. So depending on when you're watching this, it might be here or it might be here. But backend workflows, let's do it. Let's go forth. I think I have one already in here. So let's just delete it out. Let's start from scratch and we will go from there. So let's go ahead and create a new backend workflow. And we are going to make it a API workflow. So a couple things. One, we need to create an endpoint name because in the first example, we're going to call it like it's an API. So we're going to just call this testing and backend workflow. Great. Obviously, you cannot have any spaces in this. It needs to just be a single string to be able to do that. Second, we're going to say expose as a public API workflow because we are going to expose it publicly. So that we can call it, we need to have that checked. It is a post because we're changing data, and then we're going to add two parameters. We're going to make one called input text, and then we're going to make the other one input number. And we'll make that a number. Great. Fairly straightforward. Now we're going to return data. So normally you would do some other things in between and then return data from that. For this purposes, we're just going to make a very simple explanation and example. So if to return data, you go to data things, and then you say return data from API. And we'll use the structured JSON as the way that we're going to do this. And we're going to add two parameters. One is text, and we'll say that this is text. And then the next one we're going to make is number. And we will say, we're actually also just going to use text for this because I'll explain why. And then we'll click in here. This is the value in which it's going to be returned from this key. And I'm going to use arbitrary text. And I'm going to just say, this is the text you entered. And then I'll put the dynamic data, input text, just to show you that it's doing something within this backend workflow versus it just directly returning the data back. Great. And we're going to do the same thing for the number. And we're going to say arbitrary text. And then we're going to say, this is the number you entered. Great. And then we're going to say input number. Great. All right. So that's all that's going to do is basically we're going to send it a piece of a number, and then we're going to return that back with the string ahead of it. This is the text that you entered. This is the number you entered. Straightforward. Now, I'm going to go ahead and try to just do this, and I'll just demonstrate what happens when you don't use one of these methods to be able to return the data. So let's go back to the index to the page that we have set up. Back to this in terms of the run backend workflow. Let's add a workflow into this. And I'm going to say, great, we are going to run a backend workflow. So let's go backend workflow, schedule backend workflow. The one that we're going to send is the testing backend workflow flow, input text. We are going to use the input that has been provided in the form there. We're going to do the input number. So we're going to do that value, and then we're going to schedule it for the current date and time. And then we're going to send that data to a state in here. So I already have a state set up on an element. So I'm going to go set state of an element. The element that we're going to set is just this group main. And then I will say backend workflow response. Great. And then the value is going to be the result of step one's backend workflow. Cool. So let's go ahead and run that and see what happens. So I have the preview page here. I'm just going to put in hello, and then I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to run the backend workflow, and then it's going to do something and it just returns a number. And this is basically, I think it's the number of times that that a backend workflow has been run, I believe is this number, but it's not the response back that we wanted. It's not this is the text that you entered, this is the number we entered. It's just a number that's getting returned back. So instead, and this is why we need to do these other methods, we're going to do some different things. So let's go back and let's do first the API connector version of this. So to start off with that, we are going to go to our plugins. We're going to add the API connector. Should be at the top, but if not, you can search for it and find it. You install that, and then we're going to set up an API. We're going to just call this internal bubble. And we're going to do authentication because we do want it to be authenticated, so no one can just send anything to this endpoint and get stuff back. We want to protect it with authentication. So I'm going to say private key in header. And how this works within Bubble is we have authorization, and then we would put the private key. We need the private key, which actually can be found in settings. Before we do that, so we go over to settings and we go back to that API and we just say generate new API token. Go ahead and create this. I'm just going to call it internal. And this is the private key that we can use within the header there. So if I click on that, it copies it. And I can go back to the plugin API connector to finish the setup. For these private keys, we do put in the word bearer up front and then a space. And then we paste in the key that has been provided. So that enables us to run this API workflow with authentication for everything internal. The next thing that we're going to do is we are going to create the actual API connection to our own backend workflow. So we're going to just call this testing backend workflow. We're going to make it an action, and we're going to make it a post. And now we need a URL. So what is our URL? Again, go back to the settings for API and you'll find it right there. The workflow API root URL is this. And you'll see it's basically your root website URL, then / API 1.1, and then workflow. So this is what you put in first. So let's go ahead and put that in. And then after that is what you put in the name of the backend workflow that you've created. So if I go to my backend workflow, I'll see that this one was named testing backend workflow like that. So I'll just use that name, that endpoint name, and I will go back to my plugins and I will paste this after. So it would be workflow and then / and then it'll be the name of the workflow. And that's how you call your backend workflow. Great. The next thing that we need to do is we need to set up the body. So we have two items that are going to be provided in here. One is going to be input text and one is going to be input number. So let's create a body, an object here, and we are going to then type that up just like you would do for other inputs for other APIs. So we're going to say input text. And then we'll make that dynamic. Great. And we'll put a comma after that. And then we will make it input number. And then we'll say input number as a dynamic value. Great. We'll uncheck private for that to make it so that we can use it. And then we can say hello, and we'll put this in quotation marks because that's what it needs to be as a string. And then we'll say 1, 2, 3 for input number. And then I can just go ahead and initialize this call. And you'll see it come back that now I have things that came back. And you'll see The response text is, this is the text you entered, hello. And the response number is, this is the number you entered, 123, which is exactly what we wanted to come back. So just to answer a couple questions, if you have them, where did I get input text and input number? That goes back to the backend workflow setup. Again, those are the parameters that we've set up, the key input text and input number. So this needs to match whatever you put in here. That is what you put in the body as the different keys for the inputs that you provide. Two other things that we're going to do to make this better for us moving forward. One, I'm going to say include errors in response and allow workflow actions to continue. I find that to be a good practice to always put on API connector calls. And this next thing that we're going to do is we're going to actually copy out this part from the / right before API all the way here. I'm going to press copy, and I'm going to make that a dynamic parameter. And I'll explain why. So I'm just going to say this is called URL. And then I'm going to initially just put this back in there as that. But the reason why I do that is because as you see here, it has version test at the end. Well, what happens when you send this to production? Well, then that version test is going to go away. And you want it to make sure it's calling the production version of this when you actually go live with it, or the live version. And so what this does is basically we're going to set something up that's going to automatically select the right URL based on if it's the production or the development instance, or it's the production live instance of your app. The other thing is if you change the URL, the domain for your app, it'll also automatically update that here. So we know that the structure is your core URL plus this API / 1.1 / WF / your backend workflow. So we're going to create that and set that up in the workflow. So it's that way. So now I can reinitialize this call with these changes, and it should come back the same thing, except now we get body status, body response text, body response number. And as you can see, you still get, this is the text you entered, hello. This is the number you entered, 123, which is exactly what we want. Let's go ahead and connect that into our actual website, or the actual workflow on the front end. So let's click on that and click edit workflow. And instead of doing this, I'm going to delete it. And I will add a new thing here, which is going to be plugins, internal bubble testing backend workflow, which is that API that we've set up in the API connector. So I do that. And now, all right, so what do we do here? Path URL. We go to insert dynamic data, and there's something called this, it's website home URL. And that is what is going to automatically change depending on the environment that you're in, whether you're in the development environment or the production environment, whether you change the domain name and so forth. It's automatically going to fill that in so that it sends the first part correct. Next, input. We're going to connect this over to the input that was provided. So I'm going to say input text value, and then we're going to do something called formatted as JSON safe, because we're sending it as a JSON object over. And so we need the text to be formatted as JSON safe. And then what that does is it adds the quotation marks on the other end, and then it exits or escapes out any special characters that would break the API call. Next is the number. And so we are going to, again, make this a number that is the input numbers value. And for numbers, we don't have to worry about the JSON safe side, so we'll just keep it like that. And then we'll change the set state to now result of step one's response. Actually, we are going to do a arbitrary text here instead, because we're going to add both of them in there. So let's do arbitrary text. And then we're going to say, we'll insert the result of step one's body's response text. Great. And then we'll add some space. And then we're going to say result of step one's response number. Great. And so that both of those will now be returned. So now if I go back to my example app, I'll refresh this. We'll put in something else like hello there, and we'll say 567. And we'll run the backend workflow. And now you see it quickly got back. This is the text you entered. Hello there. And this is the number you entered, 567. So now it's working to actually get return data back from the backend workflow through the API connector. All right, so now we're going to go back to the app, and then we are going to set up this other version, which is called App Connector. So instead of using the internal API connector to connect to an API, we're going to use what's called the App Connector. So first, let's go to plugins. Let's go ahead and add that plugin. So we're going to say App Connector. You can see it's a lot less installs than the API connector, but it's still a very useful tool. So on that side, we're going to add a new Bubble app. The way that we do that, so this is usually for accessing another Bubble app through API calls. This is a way to share users, workflows, etc. But in this instance, we're just actually going to connect our app to itself. To get this, we need to go to our preview page, and we can see that is this part. So let's go ahead and put that in. The app name, we're just going to, this is whatever you want it to be. This is what is going to be show up in the UI for you to select it to call. And then the private key is the same thing that's under settings. So if I go back to this private key, copy, and go back to the setup, I can put it in. Great. So I can't click this yet to add an API call, but if I refresh app metadata, you'll see that it'll fetch the data from the app, and then it'll enable me to add an API call. So if I add that, it'll select the first one that's available. You can select any of them to add to this. You can set it up as an action, and then you can say authentication is going to use the API key. And that's all you need to do. You don't need to set up the JSON body or set up anything else to make it work. It's all ready to go. And so you'll see this on our workflow as we replace out this with the new version. I'll go ahead and delete that. We can then create the one using the app connector. So what that is we're using this run testing backend workflow. And then we select that, and then everything's already set up. The input text, input number is already there. So we just put in input text value. We don't need to do format as JSON safe or anything like that. And then input number, we just put in the input numbers value, and then that's all set up and ready to go. And then we just connect it. And so on this side, we're going to, let's go ahead and delete this all out and start from a new arbitrary text. And we can now say result of step 1, which is using the app connector, and you can see data fields text is already available as an option. Put that there, enter a couple times, and then we can do result of step 1's number as another option. And click that, and then you can see that it's all set up and ready to go. So now if I go back to my preview app, click refresh, I can say hello again, and I'm going to say 3, 2, 1, and we're going to hit run. And then you can see that we get it back. This is the text you enter back. Hello again. This is the number you entered, 3, 2, 1. And then that is now using the app connector to connect to the backend workflow and then get the returned data back. All right. That's all we got. So quickly, we're showing you how to actually return data back from the backend workflows. There are two options. One, you can use the API connector and create an API that you then expose publicly and then enable you to do that through this. Or you can use the app connector to do the same thing. Good luck and enjoy.